was an interesting discussion. Very strong and unanimous. We already did that. I know.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight we have a rare treat on a rare treat of a day, I must say. I would like to ask any of you that have cell phones if you could turn them to vibrate or turn them off so that we can proceed. But tonight we have Ambassador Felix Rohatyn here at the Kennedy School of Government. And the ambassador part has to do with France. And as many of you know, we've had some extraordinary ambassadors to France. For example, the first three, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams. They didn't always like each other, but we have another extraordinary ambassador from France here with us tonight, and he's going to speak on freedom, fairness, and American capitalism. It's extraordinary in a variety of different ways, largely because of his contributions, but also because of his background. He was born in Vienna and moved to France and received his secondary education in France during the 1940s, moved there in part because of the emerging dangers. And the threat of the Holocaust was spreading. And he has some remarkable stories about trying to get out, eventually getting to Vichy, France, and eventually, through the help of some basically then unknown diplomats, managed to get a visa with his family and leave, and ultimately avoid absolutely certain death. And went from France to Algeria to Morocco, Portugal, Brazil, and ultimately here to the United States, and we are very much the beneficiary of that. When he returned to France, he finally returned again to France in 1997, where he served as ambassador in the year 2000, until the year 2000. He's a master financier, but he's also an urban policy expert. He helps troubled organizations in various ways, including New York City. He was head of the Municipal Assistance Corporation, and he conceived and spearheaded the frankly ingenious multi-billion-dollar plan that saved America's largest city from what lots of people thought was essentially certain financial meltdown. He also led the New York Stock Exchange Crisis Committee through a period of great instability in the 1970s, working to find financing that kept, again, tottering companies from collapse. During the 1980s, he emerged as Wall Street's preeminent deal maker. He guided a host of the world's largest corporations through the takeover wars of the 1980s, negotiating a number of historic mergers and acquisitions. He's one of the most original and influential economic thinkers in the world. He's very well versed indeed in American capitalism. In fact, he wrote a book on the topic called Money Games, My Journey Through American Capitalism, 1950 to 2000. He's served on the board of governors of the New York Stock Exchange and the boards of numerous multinational corporations. And in addition to this work, he's served as managing director of the investment firm Lazard Perez and Company, and in New York is now the president of Roten Associates. Regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal. His columns and editorials appear in the New York Times and the Washington Post. He's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's, of course, received numerous academic and honorary degrees. He's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a commander in the French Legion of Honor. You will find tonight is a Renaissance man who has done it all, but continues to think and continues to worry. And this is our chance to hear about capitalism and the future of freedom and fairness. Ambassador Roten.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I really didn't do all these things that the dean talks about, but it sounds good. I picked the subject that I'm going to talk about tonight when I heard the president suggest that freedom and democracy were going to be the centerpiece of our foreign policy, and that we were going to put a very, very heavy emphasis in our public diplomacy to reach the hearts and minds, especially of the Arab nations of the Middle East, in order to hopefully bring them around to democratic and free institutions. And it occurred to me that maybe before doing that, we ought to think about maintaining our relationships with our allies, because they're not always all that sure about how freedom and democracy works in this country and how it compares with their own ideas of freedom and democracy. So I thought if you will allow me that I would spend a few minutes telling you how at least I think the people overseas look at us in terms both of our institution and our democracy. And I begin with George Kennan, who was probably one of the greatest diplomats we ever had, who wrote about how to fight communism in 1946 and said, "It is not enough to urge people to develop political processes similar to our own. Many foreign peoples are less interested in abstract freedom than in security." And democracy, like Rashomon, has very many faces, and American democracy, viewed from abroad, has some unique facets. During my 4 years as U.S. ambassador to France, I saw how fascinated the French are by everything American. And I believe that's true of all Europeans. While they admire much of what we do, there's also much that is contrary to their beliefs and in some cases very frightening to them. The death penalty, the power of religion in our politics, our opposition to international law are just some examples of deep differences in values. There's also a certain historical level of anti-Americanism that reflects these differences, but they're offset by a broad community of interests. Global economic instability, the fear of terrorism, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons ultimately outweigh everything else. However, the war in Iraq, unleashed a level of public hostility to America that was more virulent than anything that I could recall. The new tone of the Bush administration's dialogue with Europe has softened, which is all to the good. Domestically, it is also quite pragmatic recognition of the fact that we need each other. George W. Bush needs the support of American public opinion to commit us, and European leaders need the support of their public opinion to be able to support us. To do so, however, we have to recognize their concern about our policies. When President Bush speaks of freedom and democracy, Europeans, as well as most Americans, think of the economic freedom that is fundamental to American capitalism, of the power of the markets and the value of competition. They're fascinated by its dynamic and by the opportunities it offers. But Europeans are also troubled by the social objectives embedded in American capitalism, by the lack of a solid social safety net, by the speculative aspects of our system, by the growing inequality created by our large differentials in wealth, and by the harsh impact of extensive deregulation. Today, they're also worried about the weakness of the dollar and about policies that may lead to even greater weakness and the risk created to the global financial system. After all, Europeans own more than $2 trillion in American securities, including over 15% of all listed stocks on our exchanges, and over 5 million Americans work for European companies here. As a result of the depreciation of the dollar, they've suffered capital losses of about $800 billion since the beginning of the Bush administration. The vision we have of American capitalism is that of a market-driven system where government regulation and a Protestant ethic help ensure that the public interest is protected, where the Federal Reserve maintains a stable currency, and while a responsive budgetary policy enables strong investment in technology and innovation. A progressive tax system is then expected to provide for a fair distribution of benefits to society as a whole. Seen from abroad, however, the current practice of American capitalism is quite different. Huge government deficits are generated by a rapidly growing military budget. Taxes are being cut instead of being raised to meet these expenses. A weak dollar and burgeoning speculative bubbles in the real estate markets are the present reality and the present risk. And the tax cuts, which strongly favor upper income groups, accelerate the growing inequality in wealth and income that is creating an even more sharply divided America. Americans' antipathy to taxes is not new. In 1782, the French ambassador to the United States, who was trying to get us to repay Louis XIV the money we'd borrowed from him, said, quote, "The Americans suffer the torching of their farms, the loss of their ships, and endure all the trials of war with courage, of which they have not enough to levy taxes, which would prevent the greatest part of their calamities," unquote. The tax increases levied on upper-income Americans by Presidents Carter, Reagan, Bush I, and Clinton, in fact, improved the functioning of our economy. But we haven't changed our attitude. American capitalism is very different in practice than in theory. Market-based capitalism requires a platform of political freedom, the creation of wealth, and fairness in its distribution. The American economy reflected these values until the 1980s, when American capitalism and European social democracy created reasonably similar economic outcomes. After the New Deal and the Great Society, an implicit social contract among business, labor, and government had maintained economic stability, a strong social safety net, and an increasingly broad distribution of wealth in America. We began to diverge with Europe in the 1980s as a result of higher population growth rates in the US, coupled with significantly greater investments in research and technology. And by the 1990s, accelerating changes in our corporate culture and in the functioning of our financial markets, together with cheap money and easy speculation, resulted in the creation of astounding levels of wealth. These in turn led to serious legal and ethical abuses in the business world and to a breakdown in the concept of fairness. On December 2nd, 1988, Ross Johnson, the then chairman of RJR Nabisco, appeared on the cover of Time magazine above the headline, "A Game of Greed." Sometime earlier, Ivan Boesky had given a much applauded speech to the graduates of the University of California entitled "Greed is Good." Greed had become one of the main engines of American market capitalism, and speculation, and in some cases massive fraud, was the result. Greed is a sin, but it isn't necessarily a crime. In the case of Ross Johnson, it remained a sin. However, it can lead to crime, and in the case of Michael Milken, Ivan Boesky, and others, it did just that. In the 1990s, criminal behavior extended not only to speculators and inside traders, but also to a number of CEOs and senior corporate officers who manipulated their financial statements in order to inflate the price of their stock. In doing so, they were often aided by their auditors, their bankers, and in some cases, their lawyers. We saw some of the results recently in the criminal conviction of the former CEO of WorldCom, Bernie Ebbers. This is, however, not limited to rogue companies with rogue leaders, like WorldCom, HealthSouth, and Adelphia. Blue-chip companies such as Fannie Mae and AIG, with highly respected CEOs, have now become targets of criminal investigations. And great banks like Morgan Chase and Citigroup were forced to pay billions of dollars to settle claims for violations of security laws. And while the vast majority of American CEOs are honest and hardworking, the image day after day of important businessmen accused of a crime is an image that is doing America great harm all over the world. To European investors, the ethical lapses and regulatory failures which brought about these scandals are the most shocking aspects of our system. Seen from abroad, American capitalism has evolved, but not necessarily for the better. In the late 1990s, as ambassador to France, I spent much of my time singing the praises of American capitalism. But back at home, these factors were changing the system. A booming stock market sent executive compensation soaring, with very little accountability for performance. At the same time, deregulation, an easy money policy, and media-driven hype of new information technologies created essentially free money and astronomical stock valuations. Speculation created the dot-com bubble, and in due course brought about the collapse of much larger companies with tragic results. The results were usually the same. Management and directors collected millions in bonuses and stock sales, while tens of thousands of employees saw their jobs and their savings lost. Hundreds of thousands of stockholders were ruined. These events strike at the very heart of the most basic requirement of market capitalism: transparency and fairness. In addition, the media treated finance like show business, creating stars out of executives, and touted wealth as the sole standard of success. And neither the SEC, nor the Federal Reserve, nor the US Congress, nor the administration wanted the music to stop or acted in any way to slow it down. While no single event can be pinpointed as the start or the single cause of these corruptions, I believe a great deal of this began in the 1980s. The road to Enron was long and very well traveled. Until the 80s, overall corporate activity was still consistent with the evolution of a largely industrial economy, while the consolidation of the financial sector, of Wall Street, and the rise of institutional investors pointed to a major shift, namely late 20th century finance capitalism. Until then, the top levels of American enterprise, the big industrial companies, the big banks, were dominated by boards and CEOs who were traditional conservative businessmen with relatively high but not excessive compensation levels, whose fiefdoms were the platform of the American economy. The advent of the leveraged buyout radically changed the relationship of management to the corporation. As LBO firms such as KKR and Forstmann Little restructured American companies, they provided management with ownership levels never before imagined. The 20% ownership stake in RJR Nabisco, demanded by Ross Johnson for his small top management team, and possibly worth $2.5 billion, was simply an extreme extension of this new process, and Time magazine made it the symbol of a new age. The 1980s also coincided with the adoption of the large-scale granting of stock options. I remember sitting on the boards of some large companies at the time, pressured by institutional investors demanding changes in compensation packages aimed at a greater stock interest of management and lower cash payouts. That meant more stock options. Meanwhile, stock prices were shooting upwards with no consistent correlation to the performance of their companies. According to the author Kevin Phillips, the compensation level in 1981 for the top 10 American corporate executives had ranged from $2.3 million to $5.7 million, mostly in the form of salary and cash bonuses. Because of the shift to more options, by 1988, the compensation of the top 10 executives ranged from $11.5 million to $40 million. And by the year 2000, the range was $104 million to $290 million. While the levels of executive compensation are somewhat back from the stratosphere, they are still very high. However, during this entire period, American workers' pay increased by only slightly more than the inflation rate. During these years, the deregulation of the telecommunication industry and the breakup of AT&T, together with dramatic advances in information technology, had become a magnet for new investment. WorldCom, Quest, Global Crossing, and other companies raised tens of billions of dollars from the markets. They faked their numbers and used overinflated stock to acquire older, stronger companies and fed the myth of endless growth. The glamour of these new entrepreneurs and their new billions gave a new political dynamic to the notion of deregulation. The repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act allowed banks to re-enter the securities field from which they'd been excluded since the Great Depression. Energy deregulation brought new players into the state utility field, where traders such Enron hooked up with the internet to create a new culture of trading instead of investment. The Federal Reserve kept interest rates low and flooded the markets with money. As it found its way into the stock market, it drove prices higher and higher. The Federal Reserve did nothing to slow this down. It was fearful of bursting the bubble, and Alan Greenspan had become a convert to the new economy. A financial critical mass had been created, which at first drove stocks skyward and ultimately and inevitably exploded. In March 2000, the NASDAQ reached 5,100 and the Dow Jones 11,000. They then crashed and wiped out $7 trillion of market value. They wiped out the savings of millions of Americans, triggered the recession of 2000, and brought about the bankruptcies. The public uproar created by these scandals finally allowed the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley bill in July 2000. It required more responsibility from independent directors, certification of company finances by CEOs, and demanded separation between the investment banking and research analysis functions of the banking industry. It is important legislation, but by itself it will not suffice, and it is already under attack. We still have much to learn from what happened. New private equity funds have surpassed the original LBO investors in their size and ability to generate quick returns. Larger and larger hedge funds are being created, in highly leveraged transactions in the tens of billions of dollars each are being considered. The availability of almost unlimited amounts of bank financing is quite astonishing. Speculation is back, but the biggest speculator of all is now the US government. The Bush administration gave in to the conservative anti-tax revolution of the 70s and went to war in Iraq while greatly underestimating its $300 billion cost to date. It simultaneously engaged in a policy of massive tax cuts, probably the first time ever that a country cut taxes when going to war. The domestic budget went from surplus to a record deficit, as did our trade balance, and the Federal Reserve pushed interest rates down to all-time lows. But neither the Treasury nor the Fed acted to protect the dollar, which has declined by 40% and only drove our foreign deficit still higher. Our foreign debt has reached $4 trillion, and China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan became our largest creditors. We have become the world's largest debtor. The dollar has become one of the world's weakest currencies, and we're now facing large and increasing deficits for the foreseeable future. And to add to an already incoherent and radical fiscal policy, President Bush, with the support of Chairman Greenspan, proposed to fix a supposedly bankrupt Social Security system by borrowing a further $2 to $4 trillion to create private investment accounts. This would do nothing for Social Security, but the perspective of such huge borrowings is likely to have a seriously negative impact on the credit markets. During this period, the fairness so vital to a modern democracy was seriously impaired. As a result of the tax cuts and extraordinary levels of executive compensation, today 1% of Americans own 45% of the nation's household assets, a level not seen since 1929. And in the meantime, we continue to starve domestic public investment. Much of our infrastructure is in a state of total decay. The state of our public schools in particular is a disgrace. It would probably require $2 trillion to bring our overall infrastructure up to decent condition, and a decade or more to achieve it if we tried. We are also dead last among developed countries when it comes to foreign development assistance. Much of what has gone wrong is due to serious ethical lapses of some business leaders, as well as dramatically mistaken policies by the Bush administration. In the financial field, however, there is an additional factor involved: the dehumanizing aspect of much of the new business. Financial services used to be an extremely personal business. The making of loans, the purchase and sale of securities, the giving of financial advice, these were all activities with high levels of personal interplay, where personal character counted. Today, more and more of the financial service business involves capital markets and other trading activities. They consist of individuals facing their computer screens, buying and selling electronic signals with counterparties whom they never see in locations all over the world. The only measure of performance is the profit or loss for that day. Quality, trust, and confidence, or any other non-quantitative measures of performance, are of decreasing importance. When a group under the sponsorship of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences recently suggested the adoption of an ethics code by the financial industry, it was immediately met with a Kafkaesque notion that the very existence of such a code might increase legal liability. This is, however, an initiative that must be supported. Corporate compensation committees, as part of their reviews, should specifically take ethical conduct into account. A global financial crisis could well happen as a result of our present fiscal policies. Many experts take the view that this is very unlikely, that foreign central banks will indefinitely support the dollar, and that the global system is self-correcting. Perhaps so. The risk that the experts are wrong may be small, but it is a risk that we can't take since it's a gamble we can't afford to lose. Our economy is vastly over-leveraged, and very vulnerable to a major shock. If a crisis occurs, mainly centered on the dollar, it will require heroic, coordinated international efforts to bring it under control, as well as a level of bipartisan efforts unthinkable in the present domestic climate. To avoid the crisis, it is critical to maintain our credibility with our foreign friends as well as with those less friendly to us. I am a capitalist, and I believe that market capitalism is the best economic system ever invented. But it must be fair, it must be regulated, and it must be ethical. American capitalism is now driven by the urge to deregulate and to limit the role of government to a minimum. Hence the current attacks on the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, only 3 years after its enactment. At the end of the 19th century, Theodore Roosevelt had a different view of the earlier manifestations of American capitalism. He rejected the idea that Washington had no role but to stamp Wall Street's initiatives. He insisted on government's obligation to regulate the large new business aggregations, not so much to address the inequalities of wealth, as to police its potentially distorting influence. I believe that his war on the trusts was an effort to reinforce the new system, not to weaken it, and this should be the purpose of regulation in a more and more complicated world. The stakes are very high. Foreign investors own $5 trillion of our stocks and bonds. It is imperative that those foreign investors not only maintain their level of ownership, but actually increase it by $2 billion a day. That is the amount required to finance our current account deficit. Credit comes from the Latin verb to believe. Belief in our system is critical to maintain a global financial balance. President Bush's idea of an ownership society is an idea which is consistent with the objectives of American capitalism, but it is not credible within the context of government policies that increase our external debt every day to the detriment of our national wealth. Those policies cannot be allowed to go on indefinitely. They will require difficult and painful actions, which can only come from a multi-year bipartisan effort led by the President and the Congress with the support of business and labor. Such an effort will require a fair allocation of sacrifice in the form of budget cuts and tax increases. It must deal with entitlement programs. It must address the problem of alternative sources of energy. It should aim to rebuild the country's infrastructure, and like the Bill of Rights, it should enhance, like the GI Bill of Rights, it should enhance the creation of American intellectual capital. However, it is very late in the day, and the President and the Congress have much work to do if we hope to regain the global confidence in American capitalism, which is the challenge they must face and is fundamental to our ability to lead the free world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And obviously, you're entirely optimistic about the future of this administration. So, as is our pattern, we have the opportunity for people to ask questions if they would like. There are microphones located here, and here, here, and here. And I just would like to remind you that questions should be short and end with a question mark. While people are contemplating it, I actually had a question for you that I'd like to address. And the question is essentially this. At the beginning of your talk, you essentially talked about how there's animosity between France and the United States and so forth. Mostly, when we read about that in the paper and so forth, we hear about concerns about our foreign policy. Your talk, in effect, suggested implicitly or explicitly that it may be concerns about our internal economic policies that are even more important. Based on your own experience there in France, is that your conclusion? And if so, if we're looking to reclaim some of our legitimacy in the world, will foreign policy change alone not be enough?
Well, I don't think it's only foreign policy that is troubling people over on the other side of the Atlantic, because actually there is no such thing as foreign policy anymore. Everything is so totally interconnected that our domestic economic policy impacts them, and it impacts their policies, and it may put them in some danger, just as our foreign policy has done. I mean, when we went into Iraq, they reacted as strongly as they did. I mean, and I criticized France for, I thought, overreacting. But here, the Europeans had been creating a union in order to eliminate the possibility of war in Europe for all time. And what did we do? We brought war to their borders without asking them when we went into Iraq. So that was the impact of our foreign policy. But in terms of, we have collapsed the value of the dollar, which impacts their exports and which impacts their employment, and which impacts their own politics. And now there is a referendum in France about the European Union that may very well go down next month. And the people who are opposing this referendum and this union of the Europeans are using as a slogan that you have to oppose this union because it will bring American habits into our economy. So I believe that globalization, which is total, almost eliminates the classical lines between foreign policy and domestic policy. When you come to large powers, not, the domestic policies of Belgium don't affect us, but our domestic policies affect all of the Europeans.
Right here.
Could you comment on the French social and economic model? Here we have a very solid safety net for 60 to 70% of the population, but we have huge unemployment in France that doesn't seem to go away.
Well, one is a little bit a factor of the other. France spends almost more than 50% of its GDP by the government, which includes very fulsome health care, security, unemployment insurance, all kinds of benefits. But as a result, the economy as a whole is less and less competitive. That is not true, as a matter of fact, of their big companies, which are extremely competitive. But they also, most of them, operate more abroad than in France itself because of the difficulties of their social and social safety net, and their reaction to the reforms or to the restructurings that would be required to put them on the same level with us in terms of productivity and competitiveness are very painful, and they don't really want to go near them. On the other hand, one of the results is a 9-10% rate of unemployment, which also they don't want to deal with. And in that, they're no different from us. We want to lower our budget deficit, but we don't want to pay taxes. They want to be fully competitive, but they don't want to, at least for the time until recently, work more than 35 hours a week. They work actually 300 hours a year less than most of our people do. It's very difficult to have everything when everything is connected to everything else. I think they'll come through. I was very optimistic when the euro came in. I thought that was a very good thing. And I've always thought that a united Europe, a federal Europe, would be a wonderful thing. I don't think we're ever going to have a federal Europe because it's just too late and too difficult. But I'm not sure now that they're going to do finally, in the political arena, in foreign policy and in defense policy, in tax policy especially, enough to really get themselves in a fully competitive position.
Right up here, and I neglected to mention if you could identify yourself and then ask the question. Thank you.
Sure. Mr. Ambassador, my name is Jie Li from the business school. Could you elaborate on your view on the potential impact of the exponential growth of the hedge fund industry on the broader capital markets and the overall economy? Thank you.
Well, I have a small problem that my son, a son of mine, runs a hedge fund. But he does it very, very carefully, and very, very conservatively. And, you know, there are good hedge funds and bad hedge funds. What is, I think, the most troublesome thing about I've said, first of all, the name hedge fund is somewhat of a misnomer because it implies that you're hedged for everything, and you're not, actually, which is one of the problems. The real issue that I see today is that hedge funds and private equity firms are only the extensions of bank lending. And bank lending today is totally out of control. And without the bank lending, you couldn't have the private equity firms that put $10 billion on the table to restructure a company, or the hedge funds, which are equally financed by this monetary system that is just created extraordinarily cheap money and which encourages, of course, speculative behavior. So I would be for I don't say this to my son necessarily, but I would be for more regulation and more transparency, even though I know that more transparency would eliminate some competitive advantages that one fund may have over the other. But I believe that there is enough at stake at this point so that I think by and large transparency and intelligent, sophisticated regulation is really the only things we have to limit the potential dangers that these big, huge markets, automated markets, create to the economy.
Right up here.
Mr. Ambassador, my name is Luc Roulet. I'm from France. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the link between corporations in America and the political system, especially the financing of both parties by Wall Street. Thank you.
I think it's a poison. I think money in politics here in the United States is a poison, and it's a threat to democracy. Now, the only virtue about it is it's mostly disclosed, so at least it's not a secret poison. But it is nonetheless a poison. And people over there can't quite understand how this works. And I must say, I was away for 4 years, I came back. I still don't understand how it works, because it doesn't work. It tips the structures. But when the Supreme Court thinks it's a violation of your First Amendment rights to have unlimited political contributions that you make yourself, I mean, there is then no limit. And there is no limit. I mean, one election is practically not even over, and you're already getting calls from the senators and the Congress people who are talking about their next fundraiser. So it's a permanent process. And I think it's dreadful.
Right here.
Ambassador Rohatyn, I'm Alex Jones. I was, before I came here to be a member of the faculty of the Kennedy School, a longtime New Yorker, and I am one of those who believes that you saved my town. And I want to say, as I know many have said to you in the past,
I did not save it alone,
thank
I
you.
can tell you.
My question may sound frivolous, but it actually is quite serious. I believe that people vote with their feet. And I wondered if you would share with us how, in a general sense, you have your personal wealth invested.
Well, I'd be happy to tell you how I have my personal wealth invested, as long as you promise not to follow suit, because I am really not terribly expert, and I am 77 years old, and I'm very conservative, and I'm not looking forward to tripling my money in the next whatever years. So my investments are mostly treasuries or municipal bonds that are AAA or AA.
And what
for
would you,
about 95% of my assets.
what would you
And I
recommend
would not
to
charge
someone,
for that advice.
what would you recommend to, what would you recommend to someone who's, say, at Harvard, 58 years old?
I don't know. I don't remember what I did when I was 58.
Thank you.
Right here.
Hello, Ambassador. Thank you for coming here. My name is Stephanie Cohn. I'm French and American. I have a question for you about the Middle East. But before, I wanted to tell you a story because I know your voice very well. About 10 years ago, I was an intern at the New York Times for Craig Whitney and Roger Cohen, and I didn't know how to type well, and my first job at the New York Times was to type an interview of you that lasted about 45 minutes, and I typed it up in, I think, about 5 hours. And your voice stayed in my head, I think, for a few weeks. But
I hope it didn't disturb you too much.
No. But I'm glad to meet you today.
Thank you.
My question to you is about French interests in the Middle East. You depicted a pretty negative picture of U.S. foreign policy, current U.S. foreign policy, and U.S. domestic policy. But let's look on the bright side of life and imagine that Iraq does become a democracy and does stabilize. How would that change French interests in the Middle East and French relations to the Arab League, for example?
Well, as you know, France has a great deal of influence in the Middle East, countries like Syria, Lebanon. And as a matter of fact, I think we're having a better dialogue with France with respect to certain aspects of Middle Eastern policy. For instance, the discussions with Iran on nuclear dismantling. We worked very closely with the French, who started essentially the move to get Syria out of Lebanon. So and Iraq, the French opposed Iraq vigorously and still are not cooperating as much as I think they might or should. But if we can achieve a semi-democracy in Iraq, which I fervently hope, it would be a wonderful thing, and I would hope that it would encourage the French to be more cooperative in that sphere, and then that leaves the Middle East peace process. And I believe that France will be very supportive to whatever we do, as long as we push for a resolution, as long as we push the Israeli government, for instance, on the issue of settlements, which is what the Europeans want us to do. I believe that France will be supportive. Now, there is obviously the ancillary questions of the Muslim community and anti-Semitism in Europe, etc., which are real issues. But they're issues because France has 6 million Muslims living there. But I think their desire is their interests and ours are the same in that area. They are not hugely thrilled ever to see us as a totally dominant, hegemonic power, because it's heavy and it gets in the way and it affects their policies without their having any say in it, if you will. But as I said, we have big differences in values, although we keep talking about values as if we were exactly the same. But we have huge interests in common in terms of global security, in terms of weapons proliferation, in terms of terrorism. And I think that will ultimately prevail.
Up here.
Hi. Your talk this evening in addressing the domestic policies of this administration can leave people very concerned. You, as well as the dean and others here at the Kennedy School, served in the previous administration. If you, going forward, were asked to, say, advise the people running for president in 2008, and they were looking for a response to the domestic policies going forward, budget deficits and all the things that are going on monetarily here in the United States, what would you tell them? What would you advise them? What would you say to them that the response of the Democratic Party should be to what's going on domestically?
Well, you know, the solution, well, not solution, but how to deal with the problems that we're facing, and there were, I listed several. They're not that complicated. I mean, it's not that complicated to deal with Social Security. It requires, any number of combinations would deal with it, and they're not dramatic. Extending the retirement age by a year and a half is not dramatic. Opening up the cap on the Social Security taxes from 90,000 to whatever, 120,000, it's not dramatic. But somebody has to have the courage to do it. We don't need investment accounts to deal with Social Security. And also the notion that it is so safe to have investment accounts without the guarantees of the Social Security Trust Fund for people who have no experience in dealing with their investment is irresponsible. How to deal with we have energy problems in this country that are dramatic. And you can deal with them, but always with a combination of very unpleasant things. You don't reduce the use of gasoline by lowering the price. You reduce it by raising the price. But you talk about raising the price and you have a revolution. You don't protect the environment by going to drill in Alaska. On the other hand, we have much safer nuclear technology today, and we ought to have energy programs that deal with the short term, namely to reduce the use of foreign oil, either by putting a tariff on imported oil or putting a gas tax on. And you have a longer term resolution that involves much more nuclear power and much more alternative uses, alternative technology, and having automobiles that go 50 miles to the gallon. But, you know, it doesn't require Einstein to do that. But you look at the energy bill that the president put in the other day, and it's like, I won't even go into it. So the answer to your question is, I don't know how to advise a Democratic or any candidate, because the things that I believe have to be done are completely suicidal for a politician, until one day someone will come along and have the courage to say we've got to do. Bush could have done this on September 12th. On September 12th, Bush could have said, we're going to reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern supplies. We're going to put a 25 cents a gallon tax on gasoline. We're going to use the money to build homeland security. We're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And it would have happened. That's not a very good answer to your question, is it?
Thank you. Going to have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Rohit Shah. I'm a student both here at the Kennedy School and at Harvard Business School. And, you know, if, as you suggest, the globalization is here and it's real, and that increased regulation of corporations and the financial system generally are part of what may help restore confidence in that system, I was just curious about your sort of perspective on the role of international cooperation in regulation of markets and companies, and to the extent you have specific reform proposals, whether it's multilaterals or things like Basel II, what do you think the prospects are for actually implementing any of those changes?
Well, I think that the, excuse me. I think at the level of the central banks, the cooperation is very good, actually. I think they talk to each other a lot. They don't allow surprises to happen. They act in concert when they have to, or at least they have so far. And if there is ever, as I hope we can avoid, but if there's ever a financial crisis, the banks, the central banks will work very cooperatively together. Whether they can actually ultimately then control the thing is something else. In the securities area, the thing is more complicated because we don't have a global security regulatory system, and we don't as yet have a globally consistent accounting system. But I think we're certainly going in the direction of some type of broader accounting standards. And interestingly enough, there have been very fewer accounting scandals in Europe than here. And I finally concluded there's a very simple reason for it, because certainly in France and in most of Europe, I think the companies have to have 2 sets of auditors. And when you have 2 sets of auditors, you're less likely to have funny things happen because they control each other. But so I think in these, we're pretty far from a global financial and market system that has consistent regulation. But I think ultimately, maybe 10, 15 years from now, we will have a global electronic security trading system and some type of global regulation.
Last question.
Yeah, Bill Bates. My daughter's a senior at the college and government concentrator. Going to energy, which we talked about a minute ago, what will it take to get us to, are we going to need another crisis to get us to go back to conservation and so forth? I mean, I just read in the Iowa newspaper they're raising the speed limit to 70 miles an hour there. I mean, we don't want to drill because we don't want that, and then we want to drive big cars and we want to speed. And so what's it going to take to get us to learn to conserve again? Is it going to take another Mideast oil crisis, or in your judgment? And
Absolutely. Absolutely.
so you can't get people to think long term then, is what you're saying?
You can't even get them to think short term. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and have a nice evening.